All right. Welcome, everybody, to episode 13 of the podcast for our panel on space opera. And I'm very, very excited to chat with these three authors today. We have an amazing group. Starting off, we have a fellow Adrian. Joining us is Adrian Tchaikovsky. He's an award winning author of both science fiction and fantasy, most known for his Shadows of the Apt and Children of Time series. His latest novels, Elder Race and Shards of Earth, were released last year, and the sequel to the latter, titled Eyes of the Void, is due out in April. So thank you for being here, Adrian. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
It's an absolute pleasure. And next up, we have J.S. Duis, who I will be referring to as Jenny throughout the panel, if that's all right with you. She's the author of the Divide science fiction series, including The Last Watch and The Exiled Fleet, both of which were released last year. Double whammy of an amazing space opera. She's also a cinematographer and film editor and has written scripts for award-winning feature films and shorts. So glad to have you, Jenny. How are you?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, too. And finally, we have Jonathan Nevair. He's the author of the Windtide space opera series, including Goodbye to the Sun, Jati's Wager, and No Song But Silence, all of which were inspired by ancient Greek mythology and texts, specifically Antigone. And he also moonlights as an art historian and professor of art history. So welcome to the show, Jonathan. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So just to kick things off, I wanted to ask all of you what your personal relationships are with the space opera subgenre. This is more of a two-part question. So we start with, what is your personal history, whether that's books or films, and then tie that into what are some elements of the space opera genre that you picked up on over the course of your life and relationship with that genre. So kicking things off, we'll start with you, Jenny.
Yeah, so, like probably a lot of sci-fi writers, my initial experience was with a lot of the classic sci-fi writers like Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov and things like that. And that's kind of still to this day what I think of as space opera. And I'm kind of interested to see how this panel goes because I'm still confused about what space opera is. So I'll be really interested to hear the answers to the questions. But yeah, I think, it's, for me, the things that drew me to it were the grand sense of adventure, which could be said for a lot of sci-fi, but I think space opera really takes that to the max. And delving into the unknown and, just going far and wide and looking for things. I think a lot of people think of politics as a space opera thing. I don't really see that as much, but that might just be because I trend towards not reading as much politics in my science fiction as I'm in it for the adventure and the spectacle.
Yeah. And since you have a film background, what about films? Are there any films that stood out to you that were really evocative of space opera?
Yeah, I mean, arguably it's also fantasy, but Star Wars, of course, was big. I was a child when the new trilogy came out, and it was a big, big thing for me. And it was really my first, there's science fiction, that's a thing. And then that's what really got me into reading some more of the classics, which my dad had read, and he introduced me to and stuff. So I definitely think of Star Wars. I'm actually a big video game nerd too. So like Mass Effect is one that I always think of. And some of the newer ones like Outer Worlds and things like that, where there's a little more exploration elements. That's kind of what I look to these days.
Awesome. And Adrian, what about you? What's your personal history with space opera, and what are some of the things you picked up on over the years?
This is interesting because my idea of what space opera is, I think, is definitely at variance. I mean, I think with a lot of these genre distinctions, it's like an Overton window, and everyone places it slightly differently on the genre. So for me, when I was growing up, space opera was very much a cinematic thing, and the science fiction literature was what I would call more hard science fiction. On the base. So if we're talking about Clarke or Asimov or all of the things I was reading, it was very much, I guess, less actiony. So for me, space opera was Star Wars and that kind of more less science concerned and more sort of story and the fast paced action. But it's one of those things. The more people you talk to, you realize everyone has a different idea of what any particular genre distinction is. But yeah, for me, it was very much a cinematic thing, and it's something I feel it's the focus of books has moved to encompass that as the films sort of enter the popular imagination.
Mm-hmm. And we will get into that sort of the shifting perspective of what space opera is like, especially in the realm of books. But Jonathan, do you want to share your side of things first?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of similar backgrounds to actually both Adrian and Jenny. I'm 50, so I saw the original Star Wars in the theater as a child. And I mean, that was really the first moment where, from a cinematic viewpoint, I experienced something that for me felt like what we would call space opera. And I remember seeing that binary star in the Tatooine moment, and that was just like a light went off for me. And it was like, wait, excuse me? It was like the perceptions of my limitations of what worlds were like or could be like was just shattered. And that was just awe-inspiring to me. And I think as I moved forward, the same kind of authors really started to become of interest. Arthur C. Clarke, and that idea of distance and the vastness that you could encompass, and that kind of sublime sort of awe that you could have in the cosmos. That to me was really what space opera was. It was the distance. So it's interesting we've been talking about it. I too have a very different perspective. A lot of people I talk to think of space battles, and for me, really, space opera isn't space battles. It's adventure as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's about crossing great distances and having adventures in a galactic environment.
Yeah, well, this ties in perfectly to some of the things that obviously the perception shifts depending on each person, just as we've seen hearing from the three of you. But there's some things that people would come together and say define space opera, and I have a list of things, and obviously from one person to the next that could shift. We have melodramatic space adventures, which for me is quintessential space opera. There has to be this Jonathan, like you said, the sense of distance and the sense of adventure as you're traveling from one place to another. But then we have things like FTL travel or some form of warp drives, etc., that gets people from one place to another. And obviously that takes so many different forms as well. We have futuristic weapons and technology, galactic empires and interstellar warfare, alien races, of course. The alien races, I think, for me, is something that adds to the adventure and oddity of space opera, where you don't necessarily get so much of that in hard sci-fi, but once you get into space opera, you're introducing these things that are otherworldly. And then something else that for me feels very quintessential to space opera is romance, or just relationships, dealing with the human side of things as it's contrasted against such an inexplicably strange and beautiful backdrop of different planets or outer space. So does anyone want to jump in here and sort of tackle not necessarily all these things, but kind of give an idea of what defines space opera for you, and how that has met contention with other people that you've come across?
Yeah, so I can jump in here. I think one thing I remember seeing a while back on YouTube was someone who had given a hard and fast definition of space opera, and that it was character-driven science fiction, and that's what it was. And I was like, no. What? Because in my brain, it's much more like the epic fantasy equivalent to fantasy, where it's like a lot more about the battles and the politics and the grand scale of things. And maybe that doesn't mean that the characters are flat or useless or, not good, but it's a lot less focused on the characters and more driven by the plot. And that's kind of what I always thought of it as. So after that, I was like, am I wrong? Like, have I just been thinking of this wrong my whole life? I don't know. Maybe I have.
So confused.
But it's very confusing, honestly. But yeah, I think, I don't I see more modern science fiction as space opera as becoming more character driven. But I don't really see that as like a definition of the genre as far as like when it, really started, which I don't know the history of it, but I kind of think of like the old, like, comics or like 5-cent books that would have come out back in the day when science fiction was really starting, like that kind of like over dramatic kind of space opera thing. And that I don't think was very character driven as far as I know. So
although I'm trying to think, John Carter of Mars was, for me, obviously you could say that's like space fantasy, and it directly influenced things like Star Wars and so many other novelists down the line. But that felt pretty character driven to me. But I think there was perhaps a point in the 50s, 60s, 70s where things went more towards plot driven, a lot more emphasis on the science. So it's kind of this like strange roundabout way of perhaps now space opera is kind of returning a bit more to its roots in a way.
I think that I don't think there's a hard line between space opera and space fantasy.
Mm,
With Star Wars being the quintessential setting for that, because it is very much a fantasy story played out in space. But it's still, because the trapping, the lone kind of make it a science fiction story at the same time. I think one of the big things with space opera is it's either importing science fiction trappings into stories that are traditionally told in other settings, or it's importing those type of stories into a science fiction setting. But there are a lot of space westerns which all I
true.
think fall within that space opera thing. Star Wars is heavily influenced by the Kurosawa samurai movies,
Mm.
and as you know, there's a lot of kind of fantasy and mythic storytelling that goes into space operas. It's in the same way as there's a lot of sort of I think there's a whole other subgenre of kind of science fiction noir, sort of science fiction, sort of detective stories and cyberpunk and all that sort of thing. I think science fiction, as well as being a genre itself, is also just a very good thing to mix with other stuff to get new kind of literary areas to explore. And space opera is kind of what you get when you're telling a certain kind of adventure story, and making it a space story as well.
And obviously there are tons of trappings that come into it. All the things that I mentioned before, FTL drives and galactic empires and what have you. But
Mhm.
perhaps building on what you said, Adrian, bringing in all these different genres and mixing it with the idea of space and science, but lessening the focus on science just a bit to
Mm-hmm.
allow those other genres to bring in a certain degree of adventure, or in the
Mhm.
case of noir, a little bit more mystery. And I totally agree with you. Science fiction in this particular instance works so well as this genre blending exercise, specifically for the reason of um, the sheer vastness of stories that can be told. It's because space is infinite and the imagination is infinite, and so people can bring in noir or mystery, or they can bring in a western, or they can bring in samurai films, and then mix it with uh, this mysterious nature of space or other planets or aliens and what have you, and have the opportunity to tell a really kick-ass story. You know, Jonathan, you want to get in here?
Yeah, yeah. I almost feel that recently it's either that there's now a subgenre, a set of subgenres within a subgenre. So there's an umbrella of space opera, and there's all these series of new subgenres underneath it. You have a hard sci-fi direction and a soft sci-fi, character-driven, right, plot-driven. And it's either that, or it's kind of the more mashup approach, which we see so much now too, where it's getting mashed together. Um, and it's interesting. I wanted to just go back to something that you mentioned about how our work butts up against people's expectations of space opera, because it's kind of interesting. I definitely fall in the soft sci-fi zone for sure. But I also don't write alien species, and I write human. I write really human only space opera, which is interesting too. And sometimes people comment about that as well and say, like, I wish there would have been, multi-species within this vast galactic space. But I do think the subgenre within the subgenre thing is something that I see a lot in descriptions on space operas these days. Whether it's a character-driven space opera, whether it's X kind of a space opera.
Just jumping off of what you mentioned about your own work, from my perspective, there is something strange about the fact that someone would complain about, oh, there's no alien races, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at something like Dune, a lot of the alienness about it is the simple fact that this is it's an alteration of what we know and are familiar with of ourselves as human. And so you can use human races, or you can use human characters and place them in a culture and a setting that has shifted them in such a way based on the geology of the planet, based on their environment, based on how their culture develops in that environment. And that in and of itself is alien because of the environment. That version of a human has changed to something that is different than what we're used to. And that for me is satisfying too. That is enough of the alien presence for me to be engaged and think, how is this different, even though it is an altered analog of our own species.
I'd be curious to hear what the other what Jenny and Adrian have to say about it, because for me it's a world building choice in a way. It's, has there been first contact, or is there a long-standing epic history, right, of interspecies sort of civilization, or is it a human isolation community, right, in a galactic setting?
Yeah. Well, Jenny, Adrian, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think of space opera as far future. I don't think that there's any series I can think of that takes place in the, in our immediate future that I would call space opera. So yeah, I think you're definitely onto something there as far as it being something that, whether it's linked to, our Earth history or not, I'm thinking of something like Battlestar Galactica, like that I would still call space opera, and we don't really, are they, associated with Earth? I mean, I guess in the end we know they are, but
spoilers.
Spoiler alert. But like, that's something where it's like, that's in the future. It's more military based, obviously, but it's definitely something I would think of as space opera. And then there are other settings, which are, I'm thinking of like Planet Side by Michael Mamet or things like that, where it's like, that's near enough in our future. I wouldn't really call that space opera. I would just call that military sci-fi.
I mean,
there's.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say there's The Expanse. I think you could make a case that The Expanse was both near future enough and space opera enough, but The Expanse is frankly, it's a lot of things. It it ticks a lot of boxes simultaneously. It's quite a masterpiece, frankly, of balancing all of these factors, which would not, a bit like it holds a number of opposing magnetic poles together that are quite hard to do that smoothly. So my work is full of non-human species. Because we're talking about aliens. But then I started writing what I certainly considered to be very science-based stuff, which was still all about the non-human viewpoint, whether it's sort of alien or kind of uplifted Earth species aliens. So, that's really that's kind of the thing I'm interested in. I like reading stuff about interesting aliens. I like writing stuff about from the point of view of things that aren't humans. So that was always going to be where I went, no matter what corner of the genre I write in.
But in the case of something like Children of Time, you have an alien that is born from the manipulation of humans. So in a way, it's like you're getting this human experience, but projected onto an alien species because of what's the term? I think it's uplifting, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you want to touch on that a little bit? Just how you, if anyone hates spiders, just check out for a few minutes. Right.
Well, I mean, I will say I've been contacted by a fair number of arachnophobes saying that they hate spiders a lot less since they read the book.
Oh, that's great.
So, I feel I've saved a few spider lives through my writing. So in Children of Time, you have a world where there's an uplift project, and instead of the expected monkeys, which due to a tragic explosion failed to get delivered, the uplift nanovirus works on spiders and ants and a variety of other invertebrates. In the sequel, Children of Ruin, there are octopuses, a minor spoiler, which are really weird. And there's also an actual alien in there as well. And then there's a third book that's coming out toward the end of this year as well, with even more stuff in it. And yes, it's all to do with exploring the viewpoints of the non-human. I mean, I've written a number of books, and I'm continuing to write books where this is my focus because it's the thing that interests me. I am just working up to doing a full-on sort of alien ecosystem perspective book, which I'll probably be working on towards the back end of this year. So it is definitely, I think, if you so here is the thing. Here is the where I feel the dividing line is between so the aliens in my aliens in Shards of Earth, which is chock full of alien sort of species and cultures and so forth, and the aliens I will be writing and the aliens I have written. Aliens are alien. Aliens are not people who are not basically cat-like humans who act a bit like cats and a bit like humans, as you see there are an inordinate number of cat aliens for some reason.
And the theater production cats, of course.
Yeah, aliens are not humans with big lumpy foreheads and a very limited range of emotional responses. Aliens are alien, and if you're doing it as a hard science fiction approach, then you kind of need to have them as alien and think through, well, what is an alien? Where do they come from? How do they evolve? If you're dealing with a space opera approach, they can be all of the things I've mentioned. They can be cat people. They can be people with lumps. They can be people with big kind of rubber heads bought from the local Halloween store. Because that's not where the focus of the space opera story is. You can also have perfectly genuinely alien aliens in space opera as well. It doesn't in any way exclude them. But I'd say it doesn't actually demand the thought experiment that a hard science fiction book kind of does demand, because you're not working to the same rules and the same restrictions.
That's very true. And yeah, that's actually gotten me thinking so much about how space opera has been influenced by the visual medium of television and films, and how what you just said, immediately in my head, I'm thinking, okay, Star Trek, check, Star Wars, check, the original Battlestar Galactica. No, that was robots and stuff. Doctor Who is definitely one that goes in there, but it's just this this direction of focus that the genre,
that's exactly it.
That the genre doesn't necessarily necessitate in a way, but allows breathing room for. So space opera allows authors to focus on different things and direct the lens towards different focal points, as opposed to the thought experiments that you brought up and getting into more of the biology or the science of it and that kind of thing.
I mean, yeah, it opens a space for a whole range of stories that would be quite difficult to tell if you're trying to be very strictly scientific about things. Because I mean, if you look at, let's say, space opera setting, there are like, here's our space empire, and here is this a space empire, this is a space empire, and we all have roughly equivalent technologies, and we have this kind of Cold War going on, and we have lots of interesting politics and espionage and all these things. None of that really makes a great deal of sense in terms of hard science. I mean, just having three cultures that are able to interact on a human level is kind of bizarre, but it's the meat and drink of space opera, and it's what makes a lot of space opera stories interesting, is you can have those and you don't need to kind of fret about, well, how did this come to pass and so forth, and invent some weird alien species to gloss it all over or something like that.
Yeah. And yeah, that's perfect, because there is obviously an economy of words that authors have to take into account when they're writing. And it's like, do you dedicate more time towards the scientific explanations? Obviously not to the point of just grandiose info dumping or anything like that, but keeping the reader engaged in a certain way and tickling a certain itch, whether it be the science or the biology of it, whether it be the geology and the planet and what gave birth to an alien species like that. And then I'm thinking of Jenny and Jonathan, both of your novels, where there is a lot more focus on the human experience within these alien environments. Jonathan, uh, whether it's planets, far-flung planets, or Jenny, in your case, whether it's a ship, and you have these different environments and how the humans interact with them, and how that in turn manipulates their way of thinking. Jenny, do you want to jump in on that and just sort of talk about like the human experience within space opera?
Yeah, so in my series, there's really only in the first two books at least one alien species, and then there's sort of two hybrid species that were created a long time ago between humans and this alien species. And that's really the extent of it. And, you know, that was purposeful as far as keeping, you know, the thematic threads going. I won't get too deep into it for spoiler reasons, but, you know, it was an intentional choice. And the idea is kind of like, which this was very much inspired by Battlestar and Mass Effect and things like that, but like they use a lot of that alien technology. And even though those aliens are extinct and not around anymore, their technology is everywhere. It's their ships, it's their FTL drives, it's, you know, almost everything that they encounter on a daily basis was derived from these alien technologies, and they wouldn't be where they are without it. So it's definitely an interesting thing to look at as far as how do these interactions, you know, we usually think of like, oh, we have first contact and then they're always part of their life after on. But what if you have first contact and then they're gone and you're still left with the remnants of these, you know, how does humanity take what they've learned from this species and grow or regress or fight about it, or who knows, you know, there's a lot of different options you can take. So that's kind of what I like to play with as far as like playing with, you know, a trope that you are used to seeing, but how can we kind of twist it and do something a little different with it?
And like you mentioned, the gene pool has been tainted, so to say, and how that changes people's perspectives of other crossbreeds, other people within their own species. It's like this game of, you know, what's your perspective on the aliens, and then what's your perspective on these humans that have been mixed with them, like gene spliced and that kind of thing, and how that comments on the division that we see within our own lives and our own world, but how that's translated out into space.
Yeah, definitely.
And Jonathan, what about you? Do you want to get in on this?
Yeah. So I'm really interested in the human experience, and what I like, I realized something I was thinking about today, and in reflecting after having the three books run their course, I realized that I like to write close POVs in expansive settings. And I think that space opera gives me the ability to take a character-driven approach, but planet hop. And I'm not particularly drawn to the spaceship experience. For me, space opera is about being able to move from planetary setting to planetary setting. That's what excites me as a writer. I still do have spaceship environments and scenes, but not really big battles. But I think that for me, the interest is about placing humans in different environmental and just sort of ecological conditions, and have there be some kind of conflict. And whether that conflict is, like Adrian was saying, a disparity between, let's say, technological in a certain society, a technological capacity or access to technology between different cultures, even in the same places. That's what really excites me about working with that human experience. And depending on where you are and what you're surrounded by, whether it's environment or socioeconomic conditions, you end up being able to kind of describe a number of different things within the same book. And that's something that I think really excites me about the human experience in space opera, is having the ability to throw people into all kinds of different settings, and move from place to place. I'm sure you want to talk, it sounds like you want to talk about FTL down the road and at some point. But I'm not a hard science fiction writer. Full disclosure, I'm soft sci-fi. I love reading hard science fiction space opera. I really enjoy it, partly because it's always a learning process for me, but I don't have that knowledge. So for me, FTL is an ability to move me from place to place and to put people in conditions.
As opposed to getting into the nitty-gritty of how that FTL works.
Yeah, don't ask me ever how that works. It just works.
I have not done my research.
Just push the button. Yeah.
Cool. Well, we've all been talking about different aspects of your particular novels, but I'm curious what the decision-making process was like to get you towards writing and publishing your first space opera novel. Sort of like what was the thought process in terms of, I want to write space opera and these are the reasons why, and this is what I hope to achieve with that. So what was your first space opera novel? Adrian, we'll start with you. And how did that come to existence in the world?
I am at variance with my readers on this point, but from my personal point of view, my first space opera novel is actually Shards of Earth from last year. Children of Time gets called a space opera a lot. In my mind, it's more of a sciencey book.
Yeah.
But everyone's mileage varies wildly on that point, as we've discussed. So for Shards of Earth, I just come off Children of Ruin. In Children of Ruin, there is a lot of pottering about within a solar system, and in order to keep it within the bounds of the approximate bounds of possibility that I was working with, that takes a really long time. It takes a very long time to go from planet to planet, even with technology vastly more advanced than ours, because physics and the idea of I just want to have faster than light travel and artificial gravity and all these other things that probably couldn't ever exist, because they make things so much more convenient to tell stories, and you can zip around and you can go from you're not stuck with just these planets. You can have some other planets if you want some new planets, and you can have people standing on the floor and all of this basic quality of life things for my characters that they had been doing without for a long time. And then because it was me, I decided, fine, I'll have faster than light travel. And then I will go into ridiculous amounts of detail about how it works and what it does and make it the focus of the book. And that's kind of my own personal bugbears, frankly. But yeah, it was really just the opportunity to play in that bigger playground where I didn't basically have to hand everything in to the science teacher in my head and get it marked with red pen after each one.
And Jenny, what about you? What was your thought process going into writing your first space opera novel, whether it was The Last Watch or something that was unpublished before that, or some script that you wrote back in the day?
Yeah, so fan fiction withstanding. The Last Watch is my first space opera novel. I had written one novel prior to that, which was post-apocalyptic, because I was fresh off of Fallout 4 and it was on my mind. So that's what I wrote. But after I wrote that, I never queried it or anything, but I kind of went through the process of learning how to write a query letter and all of that stuff. And I realized that nobody wanted my post-apocalyptic novel, so I wasn't even going to try. So going off of that, I was like, okay, what else do I like, that I could write about? And obviously science fiction came to the forefront, and things like Mass Effect inspired that, and Battlestar Galactica. But really what inspired it was I had an idea based on a song lyric that goes I'm forgetting it. It's literally on a poster, but I'll fly a starship across the universe divide. That's obviously a science fiction book. So really, it was just that inspiration was like, okay, I guess you're writing a space opera. But what I like to say / warn people is that The Last Watch I don't see as a space opera, but the series is a space opera. It grows pretty slowly over the course of each book. You know, there's only 2 books currently and a third that will be coming. Hopefully there will be a fourth, maybe more, who knows. But it will grow into what more people would call a space opera over time. But the first book is very contained. You know, there are very few locations. It takes place over a course of, I think, about 30 hours total. Like, you see every moment of those characters' experiences, and that's not really what I think most people would say is a space opera. But if you look at the series as a whole, it would be, and I think that is just that kind of came from me wanting to take people who at one point were like me and didn't really know a lot about science fiction and kind of ease them into, oh, look, you can read this. This is like a little more grounded. And then, like, as they get to the next book, it opens up a little more. And the next book, it opens up a little more, and kind of ease them into the whole sci-fi fantasy genre as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Just hook them with book 1, and then shit gets weirder and weirder.
Yeah.
Yep. And Jonathan, what about you? What was your experience like deciding that you wanted to write and then choosing space opera as your methodology?
Yeah, I too wrote a post-apocalyptic near future that will never see the light of day, and
the time has passed. The time has passed for
it's like Raiders of the Lost Ark, when they put the Ark at the end right away. But I think what happened was writing that other post-apocalyptic book revealed to me some restrictions that I didn't like, and I think by going over to space opera, I was able to really kind of open up my speculative fiction wings in a way. And I wanted to unshackle myself from our history in a way, and even our scientific and ecological limitations. And I wanted to have real liberty with inventiveness. And I wanted to kind of go and do the long galactic history. I was reading Foundation and things like that around that time. And I wanted to kind of create a epic that had past ages, and I didn't want to have to rely on deferring back to the real history or connect us to the history of Earth history. And I think that was one of the things that really was important for me. And I think that's really what drew me to the space opera context. Jenny, like you, actually, my first book too, some people don't say it's space opera. And then the second and third book in this series, I feel like I started to get a little more expansive and a little more space opera-y. Because there's only maybe two primary settings and one intermittent setting in the first book. But yeah, for me, it was about the speculation that I guess I could have. I liked that. Mm-hmm. Felt liberating, especially I'm sorry. I was going to say, with my background as an art historian, like, I've written for so many years in an academic context where it's like everything has to be from a research-based methodology. I always had to point to facts and point to existing evidence to write something, and it just felt so liberating to just be free of that.
It's like, I don't have to do anything in the format of a paper.
No footnote and endnote. But seriously, it was nice to not have to, or to be able to invent the evidence you needed, and invent the past to make the present viable. That was really interesting.
Mm-hmm. And now that you've written 3 books within the space opera genre, how has your perspective on space opera in general changed now that you've sort of gone through the battle, gone through the trenches?
I don't know if it's changed too much. It's drawn me to some authors who I wasn't aware of that I'm really excited about. C.J. Cherryh is a new author for me, who I'd never really read before, and I'm going back and reading a lot of her work and really enjoying it, being that it's very character focused and has that kind of very close POV and expansive world. So I think I'm finding myself leaning into different authors maybe than the kinds of authors I was reading before I wrote this particular trilogy, which is really exciting because there's a whole series of shelves of authors who I'd never been aware of before, and that's exciting.
Mm-hmm. And Adrian, what about you? Has your perspective sort of shifted now that you spent much more time within the framework of, more technical sci-fi, I guess, in the sense of Children of Time and those books, and then space opera with Shards of Earth?
I don't think my perspective has shifted. I think it's been a real joy to kind of get to play with the sort of stuff that I always enjoyed to read and watch.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, when going, because I started off with a fantasy author, so going to sci-fi from fantasy was the same kind of thing. But I was getting to write the sort of science fiction-y books I remember reading, and now I'm getting to do the sort of thing that I remember kind of watching on the screen, but in book form. So it's been an absolute pleasure to kind of expand my range, even just within the science fiction sort of envelope.
Mm-hmm. And just out of curiosity, how is that shift for you going between fantasy and into science fiction?
I'm I'm having to fight quite hard to actually write fantasy stuff. I mean, I am still doing that, but it is very much the case that I've become known as a science fiction author, when previously I was very much a kind of an epic fantasy writer, and that's been a bit weird because now it very much affects when I'm talking to my agents and so forth, what sort of books we pitch and what sort of ideas I get moved up the list as this is a good thing to do because people want the science fiction from me now,
Mm-hmm.
rather than the fantasy.
It's like whatever the fans demand.
Well, I mean, certainly whatever the publishers will publish.
Yeah, but I imagine that was quite a similar to Jonathan, kind of liberating in the sense that you were not, Jonathan had his academic bubble and you were in your fantasy bubble, and then you got to break out of that and burst through into science fiction and just let your mind flow in a different way.
Yeah, there's kind of a daily battle to stop ending up in just another bubble, though. I'm trying to keep my own personal FTL travel going
between Fantasy Planet and Science Fiction Planet. And Jenny, what about you? Now that you've written your two books in the Divide series and working on the third, has your perspective on space opera changed, or do you feel a little bit more, how do we say, comfortable within that realm?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. My experience is kind of similar to Jonathan and Adrian in that, I came from screenwriting, and I came from a very practical screenwriting background where I was only writing a thing if I had the intention to make the thing. So I wasn't going to write a space opera script because there's no way an indie filmmaker is making a space opera. So I was pretty confined in what I could write as far from the script writing perspective, and moving over to, I first went to fan fiction and I was like, this is great. Like, I already got the characters in the setting and I can just have them talk to each other, and I love dialogue. So that was a lot of fun.
Out of curiosity, what was your fan fiction about?
Well,
if you don't mind sharing.
No, it's fine. It started out Dragon Age 2.
Nice.
I wrote basically 3 full-length novel-length fan fictions for that. And then Fallout 4 was really the big one, and that's the one that kind of kicked me into trying my own stuff, because it was right when Fallout 4 came out, and it was a very popular pairing of characters, and it got a lot of positive comments and a lot of feedback, and people were waiting every week for my chapters, and I was like, ooh, this is fun. Like, people want to read what I'm writing. Maybe I should write my own thing. And that's really what transitioned direct. Like, my first book is dedicated to that character, like that was in that fan fiction. So that's really what got me into writing my own stuff. And then now it's like, in a book, I don't got to worry about what the movie's going to be like, because if someone wants to make it, they're going to figure it out. And it's not going to have anything to do with me. So I'm just going to write anything my mind can think of, and that is definitely exciting and freeing in a way, for sure.
Do you think if it gets optioned for TV or film or anything, would you want to take part in the screenwriting process, or would you just want
You
to leave it
know,
in the hands of somebody else just to see how it turns out?
I don't know. I get asked that a lot, and I'm kind of just like, let the professionals deal with it. I don't want to do it. Because I'm so separated from that at this point. And, I never wrote for Hollywood. I wrote for indie films and commercials and things like that. So I wasn't in that realm even. So I definitely think, I don't know, it would depend on the circumstances and who was optioning it. And like, normally that wouldn't even be an option. Like, they're probably not going to ask me. Like, they're just going to go do their own thing with it. If in some world they're like, hey, do you want to write this or co-write this? I would probably, dust off all my screenwriting books and figure out how to write a screenplay again. But
yeah, I mean, that would be a pretty exciting experience. But Hollywood is it's a fucking
it's a whole beast. Yeah.
crazy industry. Yeah. Jonathan, we'll jump back to you. I wanted to ask each of you what, now that we've kind of touched on how you got into writing space opera, what that experience has been like. I'm curious if they came up at any point, what your intentions were in terms of trying to subvert things that you've seen in the space opera genre for a long time, whether that's taking something that was that a good idea that has persisted and you try to freshen it up and reinvent it in some sort of way, or something that's antiquated and you want to either question it or introduce some sort of reversal.
Yeah, I think there's two things that stick out to me. The first one is that, again, that liberation by separating myself and divorcing myself from existing, let's say, Earth history, was being able to invent a culture. In this case, I focused on gender, where there's a kind of a diverse and accepted language of gender in day-to-day life that is no longer a conflict and really exists sort of without tension. And I liked being able to do that. And I think that, gender is a really important, I think, component of a lot of writing across all genres right now. And I think it's getting a lot of important attention, and speculative fiction has the ability to think about that. And I liked the idea of having a world where that wasn't going to be the conflict, something else was. But it offered the ability to inhabit yourself when you're reading the book into a world that was different. And I wanted to do that, and I liked doing that. I think the other thing that I wanted to do was to work with ethics, which is really what the series is about in the end. I mean, all three of those Greek texts that I refer to all involve ethics, especially, family versus state, larger forms of justice, and vengeance and cycles of vengeance and dialectics. And I really wanted, in a way, to infuse a process that led to actually hope, which I don't know is always really that prominent within. I mean, it's becoming more prominent. Hope punk is becoming this, term we're hearing a lot generally, I think, within science fiction. But I really wanted my space opera to go through a cycle that included a series of philosophical musings that could end on a tone of hope. And oddly enough, fantasy was a really big inspiration for me. I had recently taught a class on fantasy art and the history of fantasy art, and I had the students read Tolkien's On Fairy Stories, which was a really interesting theoretical essay he did, and he talks about a concept called eucatastrophe in there, and I actually didn't realize it so much, but I ended up really embodying a kind of idea of eucatastrophe, where out of something horrific and catastrophic comes the hope and promise of a way forward. And so I think those are the two things for me that I really wanted to work on. was creating an alternative form of reality for people to become inhabited in the books, and then also to really work through some rigorous ethical issues.
And space opera provides the perfect um, experiment, sort of like laboratory to explore these ideas of alternate cultures and alternate representations of what we are experiencing right now. I think I brought it up earlier, but there's so much room to take what we are struggling with right now, something like gender, and how to uh, present gender in a way that um, there's unanimity across our culture as to how we approach that, how we call somebody, what kinds of pronouns we use, that kind of thing. And then you, in your books, use that laboratory to infuse it in such a way where the culture doesn't fight against that. That's not the fight. But you do offer insight into alternative ways of thinking and sort of get the conversation started as to it's this very subtle infused element in Jonathan's work, and therefore spur the imagination of an individual reader of how they could go about doing that in their daily life here on Earth in 2022. So I think,
Yeah.
yeah, you had a good approach there, and space opera is the perfect ground with which to grow those ideas. And Adrian, what about you? If you have had a certain intentions when approaching space opera, ways that you wanted to subvert antiquated ideas or reinvent the good ones.
Yeah, I mean, I'd certainly. I mean, I don't. I'm not. I've certainly tried to be considerably more diverse than you might have seen in early space opera days, when it was still very. Again, talking about people using science fiction to retell stories from other genres, the stories they're retelling are very white male stories, and therefore the early science fiction retellings of them were very white male stories, and white male, straight, able, etc., etc. And so I've tried to broaden out from that, but I don't think that's a particularly grand thing that I've done. I think that's the thing that the genre is doing in general, and I'm just kind of keeping pace with where it's going by doing that. It's kind of like, feels like a bare minimum thing rather than anything grand. I think the big thing I brought that is particularly me is just the way my human cultures interact with the inhuman ones. I've tried to bring a lot of nuance to the various sort of alien species and societies, and to kind of subvert expectations to a certain extent. So none of the alien species you run into are necessarily quite what they seem or what the humans sort of stereotype them as. And as the series goes on, you learn considerably more about. So the one that look, so for example, you've got one called the Neramathi, and in the history of the series, they are the bad sort of aliens that you can't get on with, and you have a fight every time you run into them because they seem to be utterly mad. And then people run into the architects, which are the main thrust of the book. The architects turn up and destroy planets, or at least rework them into weird artwork. They do it to Earth. We end up in a big war with the architects. And we find out that these Neramathi, the aliens we couldn't get on with, they really hate architects because the architects are the reason they're just wandering about with no actual society or homeworld or anything like that. And so suddenly the big evil aliens that we were tooling up to have a war with are our best friends because of the bigger threat. And a lot of the I think one advantage to coming to space opera at this point, when there's been a lot of space opera in the past, decades of it, is there are some established genre conventions that you can play with and turn on their head because everyone knows them well enough to see what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the way that you approach, from the reader's perspective, creating empathy for an alien species is fascinating because, in Children of Time, I love spiders, so I was all in on that. But I can imagine from the perspective of someone who doesn't like spiders that to go through this narrative and humanize this creature, these creatures, and then by the end of it, you have so much miscommunication, and it's the same as miscommunication on our own planet because we have so many languages and so much variation there that you get this real world experience fused with empathy of like, oh yeah, I've gone to such and such country and I didn't speak the language and this was my experience. And then you realize body language is a different form of communication. Or in the case of the spiders, they tap and they have different forms of vibrations that they use as communications. And the humans speak, and the spiders are like, we don't know what the fuck they're saying because it's inaudible to them. So it's just their mouths are moving and they're gesturing in weird ways. And so I think that's a very thoughtful way to go about it, as using aliens as a platform to create empathy for difference in general, difference of communication, difference of culture, and all these different things.
Yeah, I mean, I figured that there's literally nothing in the world that people hate more than spiders in aggregate. If you every time I go on Twitter and post a picture of a spider, someone always comes back with "burn the house to the ground" or something like that, which does not in any way amuse me. But I think it goes to show people really, really don't like spiders. So writing a book with the aim of making people feel empathy for spider characters, and even potentially side with them against the human characters, was the challenge. Basically, that was the it's a book about empathy, and if you can make people feel for spiders, you can make people feel for anything, even other people.
Exactly. And now that I've got a son, I'm teaching him. He's obsessed with flies. He just sees a fly and he makes this weird face, oh, and he makes that sound too. And anytime he sees a fly, I'm like, all right, we're gonna go for it. And I've got this electric fly swatter. And then every time he sees a spider, because he doesn't necessarily have that differentiation yet, it's like, oh, there's a shadowy form on the window. I have to point out the spider and say, no, that's our friend. We leave them be. So he's gonna learn eventually. It's like spiders are our friends. They're taking out your dreaded enemy flies whenever they get a chance. So I'm really enjoying that experience. Jenny, we'll get to you in terms of how you approach your writing within space opera from the angle of subverting certain expectations or reworking old tropes.
Yeah, so full disclosure, I'm a discovery writer, or a pantser as it's sometimes called, so I can't pretend to have had any grand agenda going into most of what I do. I literally sat down to start The Last Watch with that lyric, and that's it, and I just kind of started writing. But two things that I did know and had thought about a little bit before I started were similar to what Jonathan was talking about with gender. I don't even want to say equality, but just non-existence. Like, it just isn't a thing that seems different. So any character I write, if I were to switch the pronouns, it should read exactly the same as if I didn't. And I'm not sure that I'm always successful in that. I'm trying and going through my own internal biases and things to try to avoid that. But that's always what I'm trying to do whenever I write anything, but especially when I sat down to write that. And another thing that I really wanted to explore, which I don't think is addressed in the genre much at all at the moment, is platonic relationships. I'm big on them. My best friend is a guy. We get all kinds of crap about, oh, you can't be best friends with a guy. Like, how is this still a thing? Like, I've had male friends my entire life. It's never accepted. It drives me insane. So I was like, okay, we're going into this. There's two POV characters, a man and a woman. They're never going to be together. They never flirt. They're just best friends, platonic soulmates, I call them. And that is really the reason I'm writing the entire series, if I'm being honest. Cool, there's spaceships and battles and aliens, but it's all about the platonic relationship, yeah. And not only that main relationship, but showing how those platonic relationships look between different types of characters, some of which are the sort of the half-breeds I was talking about. Some are most are just humans, but just exploring a lot of different types of relationships and how they look, and just, there's a little romance here and there, but it's just not really existent. And the same sort of thing with the gender, where it's just, they don't talk about it. It's just how they act towards each other. And there's not like a 3 paragraphs about how it works in this society. It's just how it works. And I show that through their actions. And that was really important to me, to be subtle with those kinds of things. Another example is there's an ace character. They never talk about it, but there is an ace character. There are multiple ace characters, but it's never a thing where they're going to talk about it. I'm never going to market the book as being that way, but it just exists. And how can we show people how it should look in our society by just having it be part of every day, and it doesn't matter, and we don't talk about it, and we don't ask them questions about it because it's just a normal thing that they're used to seeing. So that was a really important thing for me. As far as sci-fi tropes, that's another thing where, because I'm a pantser, I didn't really know what I was gonna do. But as I came upon those, I found myself kind of subverting them, and I get a lot of comments from readers about that, like, "Oh, I love how you subverted all these tropes." And I was like, did I do that? Like, okay.
Me?
I don't know. Cool. Yeah. But honestly, I think part of that comes from, to be completely honest, until I started writing sci-fi, I didn't read a lot of sci-fi other than those sort of classic sci-fi books that I read as a kid, and like Star Wars tie-ins and things like that. I didn't really start reading modern sci-fi until about 4 or 5 years ago. So a lot of when I was writing this 4 or 5 years ago was just, seeing video games and movies and using that experience to tie in. So I probably had less of an idea of the tropes I was subverting, and it was more just like a happy mistake. Like,
yeah, I mean, it's like unconsciously you're just writing sci-fi in the way that, I guess, you're experiencing life in general, how you want life to be, not necessarily. I do think it can bog some writers down, not all, of course, but some writers can get bogged down by entrenching themselves too deeply within the genre that they're writing, such that they absorb way too much influence from other writers, and eventually it'll just come down to like, oh, it sounds like you just copied so and so, et cetera, et cetera. Or someone accuses you of stealing, if it gets to such a grave end result. But I think that's good, and Jenny, we will get into sort of how the genre is evolving, and if you're happy with it. And now that you're reading more modern science fiction, it'll be good to hear your perspective on that as well. Jonathan, just a quick thing that I wanted to touch on before you brought up how you used ancient Greek texts and stories as a sort of framework with which to explore ethical ideas in this sort of dual purpose approach to writing your series. So how did you come to the point where you decided, I want to use these texts as an inspirational jumping off point? And then what did framing your series with those ancient stories in mind add to the story, add to the space opera elements?
Yeah, so full disclosure, I wrote the Goodbye to the Sun with that standard querying line, standalone with series potential, right? And so it needed to have its own resolution and ending, but yet open the door, right, to something more. And, which is very symptomatic of a lot of first books that end up going on to be series. And what had happened was I had written the first book, the near future post-apocalyptic, and an agent had given me some really great criticism, which was, love your world building, love your writing. I'm not investing emotionally with your characters. And so I took some time and really did a lot of research on fiction writing and character building. And then I looked at different plot structures and different forms of writing that have very emotionally weighted characters and stories. And I ended up, of course, at the extreme example of tragedy. And I started looking at different tragedies, and I really liked Antigone, partly for things having to do with gender, but also really it was for me about the theme of family versus state, which I thought is for me a really interesting conflict. And at the time I was writing it, it was also during an administration where I thought family versus state was itself kind of a very strong conflict, and I was trying to grapple with that. And so that's how I got there. And what that did was that really gave me the ability, I think, to put my characters through the ringer. And I also was able to use and really appropriate the tragedy model on top of a 3-act structure. And there's some really interesting plot points with tragedy that are unique. And I liked the way I could kind of get away from a more standard 3-act structure and bring in some particular elements from the tragedy into that first book. And so that's how I got there with that. And then what happened was when I got picked up and the publisher offered me a series, then I thought, well, this works for me. I'm Jenny. I would die if I was just to sit down and write and pants. And I mean, I do discovery write, but I need some kind of a skeleton. And I thought, well, this worked really well, and it was really interesting. And so I started to just look around for more examples in the Greek context of ancient Greek texts and writings. And I came really to find myself at home in the Iliad, and particularly the Sack of Troy area for a heist, which I thought was a really exciting way to play around with a heist. And then for the final book, the Eumenides, part of a larger series of plays with Aeschylus, really got into some issues around justice that worked really well for me. And so I was able to kind of then appropriate those as models. And I find my creativity really amps up when I have those kinds of sources to use. And they're not retellings, but at all. They're more inspirations. You couldn't point to a character and say, this is this person's Creon. It wouldn't work that way. It's more, I want to take these moments, I want to take these ideas from that original and reuse them.
Yeah, that's very cool. And I think your approach is very similar to mine when it comes to writing, Jonathan. I call it discovery outlining.
There you go. That's it.
And then,
that's it.
And then I have my skeleton that I can jump off for the rest of it. Because I cannot pants either. Jenny, no. I applaud you for that bravery.
I applaud you for that too. I am very jealous.
I think, to be fair, I pantsed the last watch all the way through to the very end. But my other books, because of publishing and things, I have had to write some outline-ish type things. So I basically had to learn how to do that. But I come from a screenwriting background. I've been writing screenplays since I was 8 years old. So I kind of just have that natural, I could just know the plot structure without having to really think about it. And I didn't think about it at all. But then when I go try to fit it into, I actually use a 5-act structure now, fit it into that, it does fit into that somehow. So I think I just sort of intuitively did it because I had that experience screenwriting, which I'm grateful for now. So, yeah. But if I had my way, I would just pants my way through everything.
Maniac. Well, Jenny, do either you or Adrian, have you done anything similar in terms of using, it doesn't have to necessarily be ancient or mythological text, but just religious history or history in general as a framework or an allegorical element in your futuristic settings?
So I haven't used. Oh, go ahead.
No, you go.
Okay. I haven't really used a historical setting. There's a lot of in the Divide series, my debut series, there's a lot of sort of Roman inspiration as far as the military structure and some of the things, but it's real vague. And I just kind of did it because I was fascinated by the Ninth Legion at the time, and it just happened. But I am, the book I'm revising right now, which is in a different series as The Divide. That was actually inspired a lot by the Phantom of the Opera, the book, The Phantom of the Opera, actually. So it's, again, like you were saying, Jonathan, not a retelling really at all. I mean, there's a couple characters where you could be like, okay, these are sort of maybe those characters, but it's really just more about the inspiration, taking the themes that it touches on and diving really deep into that and getting into the nitty gritty of the characters and modernizing it for an audience. Christine has no agency in the Phantom of the Opera, at all. So I definitely wanted to take that and be like, okay, we're going to do a thing where she actually like has control of her life. But yeah, it's definitely a similar thing where I just kind of wanted to look at those things and, you know, dive deep into them and not really use it as a structure for the plot or do a retelling or anything like that.
But more as an inspiration and, you know,
Yeah.
like Jonathan, a jumping off point to be like, I'm
And a
gonna
soundtrack to just listen to on repeat over and over again.
And Adrian, what about you?
I mean, I've got a sort of a standard melting pot of references that I tend to dip into, and you know, there's biblical but also there's Shakespeare, and there's a disproportionate amount of T.S. Eliot, who seems to. I mean, honestly, as far as writers' inspirations go, the number of people who riff or quote from Eliot in their work is crazy. I don't know if we all had to do them at school or what, but everyone seems to touch on Eliot at some point. But
probably a lot of it is
as
subconscious at this point too. It's like just through diffusion through society of quotes that they don't even have any idea. I can attribute this to Eliot. It's like they probably heard it from some other thing.
As far as actual sort of mythical stuff, one of my books is a stealth retelling of Beowulf, from the point of view of Grendel. I can't really say which one because it would be kind of a spoiler.
I love how you call it a stealth retelling.
Yeah, I mean, I ideally I mean, you don't necessarily have to clock to it at all, but if you clock to it, it should be kind of within the last 2 chapters. You suddenly see what I'm doing and get very angry at me.
And in Children of Time, did you pull on the idea of like Noah's Ark or anything like that?
I don't think I did actually. I think, I mean, the biblical stuff. Certainly, I've in several books I've kind of played around with the Garden of Eden sort of concepts. I mean, obviously, one of the books I've got out is The Doors of Eden, which kind of touches on that. And there's certainly, with the idea of an exodus from Earth, the idea of being cast out of the garden is definitely in there.
Mm-hmm. And then I think we're going to get to the elephant in the room, which is just the shitty name of this subgenre that we all love so much. Space opera for me is a very contentious title. Obviously, genre is a difficult thing to begin with, and it's shifting all the time. I'm looking at you, young adult and new adult and all that absurdity. But space opera, for me, it was a bit confusing at first to sort of wrap my head around what is it exactly, because I have an idea of my head of what space is and what opera is, but the two of them coming together for me as a younger reader going to a bookstore, it's the bookseller saying, "Oh, this is space opera," and I'm like, what does that mean? I don't understand. So obviously there are theatrical elements to this genre and there are space elements to this genre, but what do you all feel about the name itself and if it even does the genre justice? So whoever wants to jump in there. Jonathan, you're smiling and laughing. So
I'm just thinking of I'm thinking of the Fifth Element, and I'm thinking there's your space and your opera, right? Together.
Even though that's like partially cyberpunk, I don't even know how to really classify the Fifth Element.
No, I'd rather not go first on this one. Actually, I'd rather listen to the other folks if they're willing.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it is a bit of a nonsense. I'm assuming it came about as by comparison with soap opera.
I don't necessarily know. I think it came about during like the magazine days. Back when there's like astonishing science fiction and all that kind of stuff. But I'm not exactly sure about the direct origins.
But one thing, the names of genres tend to be, in general, quite clunky and ugly, and either just utterly non-descriptive, as in this case, or just sort of tunnel visionedly over descriptive of what it is. So I don't know if there's actually any way to win with genre conventions. I think they always arise organically, and they're never particularly useful or sort of aesthetically pleasing monikers.
True. And Jenny?
Yeah, so I had a similar experience as you, where when I was first introduced to that title, which was when I was in my 20s, like I had never heard it prior to that. I was like, what is that? Is it a musical space? Because I want a musical space genre, but I don't think that exists. So I was very confused. And I think it's one of those things where I think you're right. Like, because I had looked it up once and tried to research it because I was like, where the hell did this come from? It makes no sense. And I think you're right in that it came from sort of the pulp magazine era, and it meant something else, 80 years ago, whenever that was, and it has just kind of stuck with us until then. And now modern audiences are like, who are just coming into the genre, especially new readers, are confused by it and they don't know what it means. So I would like to see it eradicated. I don't know if that'll happen. I think it's one of those things where you kind of have to be in the know of the genre of like sci-fi fantasy world to understand that it doesn't mean what you think it means, but that doesn't help us bring new readers into the genre, which I think is obviously always an important goal, especially, now we're kind of living in a renaissance of geek and nerd stuff, and we need to grab all those people and bring them into our world, and we don't want to scare them away with like them thinking it's a musical, because people have thoughts about musicals too, even though I still think that would be great.
But that could be a genre unto itself. It's just like space music.
Yes.
Cool.
Yes, I would be fine with that. Or we can just take space opera, make it musicals, and then call space opera something else. I don't know what the
yeah.
Space
Jonathan?
Adventure, I guess.
Yeah, space adventure was exactly my thinking. It's like
that's usually what I call the divide. Like I never use space opera unless it's like my publisher using it as a definition. But I always say space adventure because I feel like it's just more accurate in general.
Yeah. Jonathan, have you gathered your thoughts on this?
No, not really. I mean, I definitely identify with when I tell general readers, right, who aren't science fiction, space opera specific people about my books, and I call them space opera, that I always get the response of, what's that? So it's like you have to explain it, and I usually default to this, it's an adventure in space, or I say The Expanse, or something like Adrian mentioned, something like that brings up a contemporary reference. I don't know. I mean, I don't have an answer on this one. I don't get necessarily upset too much by it. It just feels like it's become the name, but clearly it has connotations back to that pulp era, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and
I was gonna say it's funny because we space so much. So much of the references we make to explain space opera, like Star Wars and other things, really have that space fantasy component to them, which complicates things even more. But
yeah, and I feel that much of the mantle for this particular issue falls on publishers and booksellers, and Amazon could probably change the game when it comes to genre naming conventions. But like Jenny, space adventure is the first thing that comes into my mind. It's like it's an adventure in space. Perfect. And if you want something a little bit more fantastical, space fantasy, go for it. Or if you want to get into harder stuff, hard sci-fi, perfect. But space opera to me was always just this confusing thing where I just hear the name and immediately I just think of an opera, like a literal opera on the moon or in space or something like that. And it's just like, no, this is totally wrong. You can have the theatrical elements, you can have music if you want to, a dancing number, but I think for readers it's just a bit of a mind warp to have to hear these labels and then think, okay, within space opera we have stuff as varied as Jenny's work, as Jonathan's work, as Adrian's work. Obviously there's some overlap, but each of you comes at this particular thing with such different approaches. So we'll see what happens. For me, it's just kind of like, got to stick up my butt about this name, and I've had it for a long time.
Well, as we all know, in space, no one can hear you opera.
Right, exactly.
No one can hear me complain either. Well, I wanted to get your perspectives. We'll look ahead to the future of sci-fi. Jenny, as I mentioned earlier, want to get your opinion, since you mentioned that you've more recently gotten back into science fiction since you started writing The Last Watch in the Divide series. So we'll start with you. What's your take on how science fiction, how space opera is right now, and what your hopes are for the future of the genre?
Yeah, so I think, we kind of covered it before, just as far as there's a lot of diverse range within the term space opera. So now when I pick up a book that I was told by someone is space opera, I read it and I'm like, was that space opera? I don't know. Because I still can't answer that question even after talking about it for an hour. So I'm not sure. But, a lot of the newer stuff I'm reading, there's just a lot more, obviously just diversity of characters, of backgrounds, of history, of things like that, which I find super interesting because for me, I'm never going to pick up a historical fiction book. It's never going to hold my interest long enough to read it. But if you take that inspiration and you put it in a sci-fi book, I'm definitely going to read it. So I think it opens up, what we're doing now with the genre is opening up to even more readers. And if we can, fix some of these genre names and do some of these things from a publishing standpoint to fix, accessibility and approachableness of the genre, we can get more readers in and they can learn those same sorts of things about more cultures and different types of people in sort of a, I don't want to call it safer, but sort of a, more easily digestible way through the fantasy/sci-fi lens.
Yeah, just to give people an easier time finding their niche, essentially, because everyone has their niche, whether it's character driven or plot driven or what have you. Or they like it more fantastical or they like it more scientific, just to make it easier for people to have the diversity there, but to have the ability for readers to find their particular niche and continue to find new authors who are popping up within that particular niche.
Yeah, definitely.
Adrian, what about you? What's your take on this?
I mean, honestly, I think we're in a bit of a golden age of science fiction right now. I mean, most of the go-to authors that I would say, oh, you really should read, are people who are currently writing now, not sort of people from, say, the 50s and 60s. Or and I think one of the reasons we're in a golden age is a lot more of those writers are, they're coming from very different perspectives to the traditional science fiction author of yesteryear. So we're getting a phenomenal, in a genre that's very much defined by imagination, we're getting that vastly broader range of perspectives being brought to bear on science fiction, rather than everyone coming from the same kind of social and cultural stratum.
Mm-hmm. Yes, finally things are broadening out, and I guess that in part is due to the to the openness of the publishing industry in terms of bringing those voices in as opposed to shutting them out like it was back in the supposedly labeled golden age of science fiction.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly the impression I'm getting from authors of other demographics is the battle is still going on that one. I think it's possibly just more reflecting the fact that society as a wider thing has changed, rather than that publishing is necessarily leading the charge on that.
Yeah, and so it's just a matter of culture. I mean, there's the phrase politics is downstream from culture, but I think that applies for publishing too. Publishing is downstream from culture, and the opinions and viewpoints of the public and the masses and the readers and the writers themselves will shift the publishing industry. Even though it's a titanic institution, these titanic institutions can be slowly eroded by by the flow of cultural waters.
But I definitely think really more than any other area of literature, science fiction benefits from that expansion just because we have so much potential and so many places we can go.
Yeah. Just like you said, the imaginative basis for this genre, for fantasy, for science fiction, unlimited possibilities out there. So long as there's an individual who has the desire to write something and they utilize their talents to present that. Jonathan, what about you? What's your take
No,
on all this?
I agree. I agree. And I think it is a really exciting moment. I think that just accessibility to information, the acceleration rate of discovery and technology that's happening today, and our access to it just is a fuel for people with an imagination who want to write stories that fall under this thing we call space opera. And I think that, that in combination with giving a broader range of voices access to publishing and writing the stories, I think the direction looks really exciting. And I think epic fantasy has seen in recent years saw a real explosion, and I think space opera is kind of coming up now a little bit, really up there, and I think it's great.
Yeah, I agree completely. It's nice to see these genres. Obviously, there are so many different waves of popularity, and space opera has seen a ton of ebbs and flows. But
Yeah.
I think the newest wave of space opera and science fiction in general is just spectacular. Yeah, I love everything that's coming from it. And I'm curious what we'll sort of close out with two things. If you could give listeners and viewers, from your perspective, one or two of the quintessential space opera stories, whether that's fiction or television, film, video games, that kind of thing. And then let everybody know what you're currently reading, watching, listening to right now that you want to share with them. So, Jenny, we'll start with you.
Oh, geez. This is the time where I forget everything I've ever read or watched.
Just default to Mass Effect. It's fine. Yeah.
I know. I'm going to say Mass Effect. So yeah, I mean, for me, it's definitely, I feel like I think of Mass Effect, and then one of my favorite books is Rendezvous with Rama. I don't know that it really actually fits anything a normal person would define as space opera, but I love it, and I'm always going to
who cares
scream about it, so here you go. So yeah, those are kind of the two main things. I mean, Star Wars, obviously, like I do think of it more as science fantasy, especially now that I think about genre more. But, back when I first started watching it and reading about it, I wouldn't have called it that or thought about it that way. But yeah, definitely Star Wars as well. Right now, I am reading a bunch of arcs or blurbs that I don't know the names of. I'm going to skip that. We recently watched Arcane, which is phenomenal storytelling.
Oh, I need to watch that.
Go watch it right now.
Okay.
We'll wait. It's so good. Literally the best thing I've seen in years, possibly the best thing I've ever seen. It's really, really good. And then we just finished Cowboy Bebop, which I guess got canceled. Which I'm kind of bummed about, because it seems like one of those shows where, okay, maybe it didn't have the greatest first season, but it's building to something that would have been really good. So I'm kind of hoping that petition going on gets signed by a lot of people so we can keep that going. So
yeah, I mean, I love Cowboy Bebop. That is hands down my favorite space opera, and that one does include a lot of music, so it fits the category.
Yeah, nice.
But yeah, it's kind of a bummer that the show got canceled, because Netflix is usually the one who picks up canceled shows. So who knows where this will find out. Adrian, what about you? What are some of your quintessential space opera stories? And then if you could recommend to readers, or sorry, listeners and viewers what you're reading or watching right now?
I mean, I'm going to be as good as my word and recommend some current stuff rather than kind of going back into the mist of time. So, I think one of the best space opera writers, falling, I think, within pretty much everyone's definition of space opera, going on at the moment is Gareth Powell. He has a series beginning with Embers of War, which is absolutely phenomenal. The main character is a sentient former warship now pulling duty as a rescue vessel, and that in itself is just give you a fascinating kind of psychology for that ship's perspective. Also, as an example of more far out there space opera, Yoon Ha Lee's Nine Fox Gambit and sequels are really, really good. And as possibly one of the weirdest things that probably just about fits within space opera, Tamsin Muir's Gideon the Ninth is completely bonkers, but incredibly enjoyable. I've also recently watched both Arcane and Cowboy Bebop, and they were brilliant. And yes, I really hope that Cowboy Bebop gets picked up for a second series. It really deserves one. I'm currently reading James Smythe's The Edge, which is, I think, the third of his very, very weird series that began with The Explorer, which is kind of psychological space horror, I guess you'd call it.
Cool.
Very, very good books.
Awesome. And Jonathan, what about you? What are some quintessential space opera stories and recommendations of what you're currently reading or watching?
I don't watch a lot of anything. I need to get caught up on all the watching that you all do. I have to do that.
You're a teacher, man. It's okay.
Yeah, no, but I'm also going to stick with more recent, but I just wanted to second Gareth Powell from Adrian too. Gareth Powell's Embers of War series was one of the inspirations of the way I wrote my series. Actually, the first person in there was really powerful. And some broken heroes, war-torn heroes was really important. Artifact Space by Miles Cameron, I thought was absolutely spectacular. I thought it checked every box. It was one of the best things I've read for space opera in the last year or so. And it was fascinating how he integrated a lot of, I think, fantasy and medieval and earlier ideas into there. So Artifact Space by Miles Cameron, which I recently read. And whether or not it's space opera or too short or not expansive enough, I'm shouting out Murderbot. Just to shout it out, because man, oh man, and they are just fantastic. And if anyone hasn't read Murderbot, please do. It's in the writing, I think, is absolutely wonderful. I liken it to like literary filet mignon. It is like, it's so lean and pared down, and it's beautiful. It's really, really wonderful. So those are some recs. And right now I'm going to just give a shout out actually to a historical fantasy. I'm reading Marion L. Thorpe's Empire's Legacy series, which is we were talking about inspirations. It's an imaginative reinterpretation of a late Roman Empire set in an imaginary version of England. And it's very interesting. It's really great. So highly
fantastic.
recommend it.
And
Empire's Daughter is the first book.
Empire's Daughter. Okay. And I wholeheartedly second Murderbot Diaries. Love that series so much. That is my palate cleanser when I'm reading other stuff. Because the novella, like you say, it's lean like filet mignon, and that novella format just perfect. I read that between chunkier things like what Adrian writes. And and Adrian, you brought it up earlier, The Expanse. Either the TV show or the book series, both are absolutely fantastic. The TV show does some interesting things in terms of reinterpreting it to the visual medium that I think work very successfully. And if anyone likes to read things that are finished, the series wrapped up last December. So know that if you start it, you can finish it. And also the first book, we were talking about genre mashups earlier. The first book, every book sort of takes a different genre and interweaves it with space opera. And the first book is noir, and one of the main POV characters is a detective living on an asteroid colony, and it is freaking fantastic. And if you like that book, the rest of them will surely satisfy you. But yeah, The Expanse, definitely. And I want to thank you all so much, Jenny, Jonathan, Adrian, for joining me and digging into the fascinating wild world of space opera. If you could let listeners and viewers know where to find you on social media, where they can pick up your books, now's a good time. So we'll start with you, Jenny.
Yeah, so I'm on all social platforms at JSDewes, so it's JSDEWES. And my website, jsdewes.com. And yeah, my books are on paperback, audio, ebook, anywhere books are sold. You should be able to find them.
Fantastic. And Adrian?
I'm mostly accessible via Twitter at aptshadow, APT and then shadow. Other than that, I've got a website which is shadowsoftheapt.com. This is all based on my original fantasy series and is a bit outdated, and we're looking to change it.
It has to be science fiction related at this point.
Yeah, it's not terribly up to date, to be honest, because I find it quite hard to do writing stuff that isn't actually writing books.
And Adrian, all of your work is available in
yes,
Amazon.
I mean, it to a certain extent, some of it may depend on where you are. Some of the books don't have a release outside the UK. We're working on it, but most of it, I think, you can probably get certainly in the States and Canada now.
And when does Eyes of the Void release?
It's end of April, beginning of May, depending on precisely where you are. But that is getting a kind of a general UK and US release within a week or so of it.
Fantastic. And that's the sequel to Shards of Earth. So
yes, and the third one, and just in case if anyone's worried I'm going to drop dead, the third one is written and delivered, so it will happen. There's no point sending out assassins. You can't stop
it. That's a fantastic frame for alleviating all of your reader worries. Not going to drop dead. Don't worry about it.
Oh, and the third Children on book should be out about the end of this year as well.
Awesome. And Jonathan, where can everyone find you on social media and find your work?
Sure. Twitter and Instagram are my main social venues. J Nevair on both. You can get to me or my website. And the Windtide trilogy should be available on most of your usual venues that you would get to. Audio is, I think, coming this year, which is exciting.
Awesome. Will you be doing all 3 books at the same time?
That is yet to be seen. I hope so.
Okay.
And I have a release coming in November as well later in this year.
What's the title of your November release?
Shadowspark Publishing. It's Stellar Instinct, and it's a standalone space opera. It's a spy thriller.
Awesome. Yeah, you got to pimp your work, Jonathan. Come on, man.
Sorry. Yeah. I'm still recovering from my tech issues at the beginning.
It's okay. It's all working out. It's okay. But thank you all so much for being here. I had a great time chatting with you. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.